Science fiction is often seen as a place of spaceships and robots. Yet you and I live in a world of spaceships and robots, just not in the forms that science fiction shows us. Science fiction is unshackled, bounded only by imagination and the suspension of disbelief. Our world has no such luxury, which is why when science fiction shows us the inside of a rocket, it's full of all these rooms and decks and equipment. And in the real rocket that it's actually based upon, it's basically just a big gas tank. Imagine if the only vehicles on the road were tractor trailers, where the trailer held its fuel supply, and all the space that you had was in that little cab. And it took all that you had in order to get to your destination, and you'd have to just drop the trailer along the way. The spaceships of our world, where gravity's might can only be overcome by the application of controlled force on such a scale, and with so little of a margin for error, well, it's amazing that we ever got into space at all. The enormity of what was required and the ubiquity of its results, from knowing where you are at all times now, to reliable global communication, to having the information necessary for weather forecasting. Even our use for them for military purposes, sounding sinister no doubt, is actually tellingly addressed by Lyndon Johnson. Tonight we know how many missiles the enemy had, and it turned out our guesses were way off. We were doing things we didn't need to do. We were building things we didn't need to build. We were harboring fears we didn't need to harbor. Episode 1 of this series, Red Moon, begins with the dawn of the space race, a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States to be fought with milestones rather than weapons, and not for land or resources, but legitimizing a way of life. Tonight, it's the night when a man first set foot upon the moon. And that man is a Russian, Alexei Leonov, whose words make explicit this is a victory for the Soviet communist way of life. Well, as much as it might shock you to learn, Richard Nixon is pissed off at this development. Here Nixon has shown up in office in the final leg of the race to the moon, and then we lost. He doesn't want to be accused of the one who failed after all that Kennedy and Johnson had done. If that happened, well then, history might cast aspersions on his presidency, unimaginable as that might sound. Meanwhile, Ed Baldwin is as unhappy as the president. In fact, more so because he was the one on Apollo 10, the famous trial run before the actual landing of Apollo 11 in our world. To understand, let's go for a simplified version of it all. Don't quibble me over the details. This is just for those who aren't as big of a nerd as I am. America started towards space with the Mercury program and the famous Mercury 7, the ones with the right stuff, which was just about getting men up there into space and returning safely. But with the plan of aiming to get onto the moon, that required figuring out a whole hell of a lot more than that. After a bunch of ideas were considered, the way to get to the moon that was finally greenlit was one actually inspired by what a Russian rocket scientist noted about the trip to the moon, and indeed the whole issue with getting up into space in the first place. It's all about weight. The reason that you have to have all that fuel in there is because every single thing you put on there has to have enough fuel to get it up into orbit. And that includes, by the way, the weight of the fuel that you have to put in there to get stuff up into orbit. The more fuel you put in there, the more fuel you need to lift the fuel. Anyway, the brilliant idea that emerged was that you make a special craft whose sole purpose is just landing on the moon and getting back up into orbit again. That's all it does. It gets you down there, it gets you back up. It's not at all responsible for actually getting you into space or getting you to the moon. The thing that actually gets you up into space in the first place is the Saturn V rocket. And the thing that actually gets you from Earth to the moon and from the moon back to Earth is called the Command Service Module, or sometimes just the Command Module for short. So you need those two things to be able to dock with each other. So in Gemini, or Gemini as NASA seemed to like calling it for some reason, they worked out all the stuff that was going to be required for that. Spacewalks, docking, multiple men in orbit at once, longer time in space and what that does to the human body, and so on. Apollo was then working with the actual command service module and LEM. Apollo 7 showed that the CSM worked in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 showed it could go around the moon and return. Apollo 9 tested the LEM in Earth orbit and everything that would need to happen, launching, docking, making sure this crazy-looking thing could actually work in outer space. And Apollo 10? Apollo 10. Test the whole thing while orbiting the moon. Do everything short of actually landing on its surface. All the stuff is there. The CSM, the LEM, everything has been proven to work in Earth orbit. This is just ensuring it will all work out here, so that when we attempt the actual landing, we know all the other stuff has been verified to work and is reliable enough to go for the big one, which would then be Apollo 11, with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the LEM and Michael Collins in the CSM. If anything went wrong, that man would have to fly the CSM back to Earth alone. And Nixon would then read the following to the world. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. These two men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding. That point is important. Apollo 10 was a proof of concept. Everything they tested worked. Everything that lives would depend upon passed muster. Apollo 10's success allowed for the clearing of Apollo 11, but even then, there were no guarantees. The landing itself and the lifting off from the moon's surface was the remaining test. Could it all work? Apollo 10 held the curtain open for Apollo 11 to take the final risk, the last untested aspect of the journey to the moon, and see if we could both go to the moon and return safely to Earth. In reality, this was carried out by Stafford and Cernan, the latter being one of the last men to walk on the moon, actually, on Apollo 17. In the show, the two men who piloted Apollo 10 are replaced by fictionalized versions, the aforementioned Ed Baldwin and Gordo Stevens. In the fiction of this show, Sergei Korolev lived. He was the leader of the Soviet efforts to get into space, but died 3 years earlier in our reality. Possibly as a consequence of Stalin having once had him tortured and tossed in the gulag for... God only knows. This was Stalin. Who needs reasons? The show operates on the premise that if he had lived, he'd have squeaked a victory over America in getting to the moon. And naturally, no one in NASA is happy about that. Deke Slayton, in fact, comes in and essentially tells everyone, take the day off and spend the weekend getting their frustrations out of their systems so that on Monday they can get back to work going to the moon. So while the astronauts cut loose, fingers are being pointed between the CIA's failure to catch what they were doing and NASA not being fast enough. It's an interesting thought experiment because one thing that came up and comes up was that Apollo 10 should have landed, could have landed. In theory, if it had been planned and prepped before launch, if they had skipped the planned Apollo 10 mission and jumped straight to doing what 11 was supposed to do without actually conducting the tests, they maybe could have. But what a risk to attempt. Even if one didn't value the lives of the men that would be jeopardized, how would it look any better if they rushed the landing to arbitrarily beat the Russians and instead crashed into the moon? Something that's easy to forget is that this craft has been flown in space exactly once. And the two guys who did it aren't in it right now. The two men who are in it now are trying to operate a craft they've never actually used before. They've only ever simulated it. And oh yeah, they ran a lot of simulations. They did a lot of practicing. But what did they simulate? What did they practice? How to test all of the systems. They never actually simulated the landing. They weren't all ready to do it if they were called upon. They were trained and drilled for months and months and months on how to conduct a safe test of all of the systems. To expect them to land the craft would be like expecting them to fly in and blow up the Death Star. It's completely beyond anything they have been prepared for. So yes, in theory, we could have said, I don't think we need any of that testing horse shit. I, for one, say we skip all of that and just assume everything will work just fine. We built this thing to land on the moon and take off again, ergo, that's exactly what it will do. And let's make sure 2 guys who have never actually flown one of these things before are the ones to do it. Tell them to do something they've never been trained to do before, and which no one has ever actually done, to provide a frame of reference, or even to demonstrate that under optimal circumstances it's even possible. And we'll make sure to tell the entire world that we're doing it, so we can answer why we're dancing a razor's edge between first 2 men on the moon and stains on a rock. What the hell? I'm feeling lucky. I don't claim to be a rocket scientist, but it seems to me that's a bad idea. Now is the point where I talk about the Russian program. Now, I was going to talk about some of the many successes that Russia had, but, and this is absolutely 100% true, I attempted to talk about such things over footage of Russia's many space achievements. Well, apparently, you're not allowed to show Yuri Gagarin going into space or anything else like that, because, of course, the best way to celebrate Marxist-Leninist principles are to pay for the privilege. So, what do you say we skip all those achievements, since apparently they're not worth sharing anyway, and we'll go straight on to my criticisms. Fortunately, though, there is one cosmonaut whom I both respect and is willing to appear in this video, so here you go. But while these were all achievements, it should be noted that the sarcastic reference earlier to a possible Apollo 10 landing is actually a fairly accurate representation of the absurdist slapdash method that the Russian space program was using. Braun repeatedly makes the point that the Soviets are getting into space, yes, but with crude, unsophisticated technology. One horrifying example was the Vakshad 1 mission, which was to put multiple people in space before the U.S. did, except their rocket was only built with a single astronaut in mind. So, what do? Remember, it's all about weight. So, no spaceships, no ejection seats, no escape tower, no backup systems. When I give you a cowboy description of an Apollo 10 landing, I'm being sarcastic. When I describe the Soviet program, sarcasm doesn't do it justice. That mission wouldn't end in death and failure was purely down to a dependence on the reliability of Soviet technology, and these are the same people who built the only nuclear reactor to ever actually explode. If you think that's a cheap shot, since they operated in clearly different contexts, it's not to say they're equivalent, but rather to point out the fundamental flaw in the entire Soviet engineering philosophy. Because it wasn't that the Soviet engineers were lacking in knowledge or skill, they weren't. But the fact was that there were demands for results and there were horrifying penalties for failing to meet deadlines, which meant safety took a backseat to arbitrary timelines. And sometimes, safety wasn't even allowed to join in the ride. So yes, NASA was losing, much like if NASA was attempting to build a working car and were being outpaced by a bunch of hillbillies who strapped a lawnmower engine onto a bathtub. Yes, they're going to be out ahead for a little while, but once an actual properly built car is finished, they're going to be left in the dust. Which, of course, is exactly what happened. I mean, don't get me wrong, the show is great, and it does need to justify its premise in as reasonable way as possible. But NASA had run a marathon to get to the moon, while the Soviets kept sprinting, and the systemic failures finally just caught up with them. I mean, that and the safety system, which consisted entirely of pray the cosmic radiation gives you superpowers. To get back to the plot, a journalist broaches they were only 8 miles from the surface point during a press conference. Again, not quite grasping the significance of those last 8 miles. It's the equivalent of saying to a virgin, okay, you've walked up to a girl for the first time in your life. I assume you can handle things the rest of the way from here." Later on, a report finds Ed and Gordo at the bar where everyone's blowing off steam and takes advantage of their drinking and bad moods to again bring up the 8 miles thing, and gets Ed to say that NASA lost its guts after the fire. If you don't know, what's now called Apollo 1 caught fire on the ground and killed 3 astronauts, including one of the original Mercury 7, during routine training.
You're right. We don't have guts at NASA anymore.
That's going to go over about as well as strapping 2 giant testicles onto one of their rockets. During the trial run for the moon landing, Margot, a character we'd seen earlier who sleeps in her office, spots the answer to a computer glitch, but the abort is called anyway, and Wernher von Braun, her mentor, swings by to offer some advice about how to work from facts and not from feelings, which is probably not something that should be said by a scientist with a German accent. People will start looking for a hunchback and lightning capturing equipment. Meanwhile, Deke points out to Ed the degree to which he has fucked up, pointing at NASA in a moment when the country and especially the leadership are looking for someone to blame. Ed's wife tries to find the practical move forward after he gets assigned to a desk, for painting a giant bullseye on the NASA logo during National Carry Out Your Shit Day. But it just leads to a fight between the two of them because he's depressed about the degree to which he has screwed this up. And she is also upset about the degree to which he has screwed this up. And everyone else at NASA, for that matter, kind of feels the same way. Yep, he should have just landed on the moon and stayed there. That's what would have been the best. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a loudmouth prick. As Apollo 11 prepares to launch, Gene Kranz, the flight controller, calls everyone in. If his name is familiar to you, he was played by Ed Harris in Apollo 13 and said failure is not an option. Something that sounded so good the real Kranz was pleased to be credited with something that he'd never actually said. The issue before them is existential. Apollo 11 lands safely on the moon and contributes to von Braun's narrative about Soviet slapdash versus tested, sophisticated American technology. Or it fails, and then that's the end. But Kranz insists they will succeed and go beyond. It's an ambition that is breathtaking for 54 years ago, when today Mars travel is most seriously pursued by a guy who bought and renamed Twitter seemingly out of boredom. Instead, Kranz speaks of American space ambition in terms that are mind-blowing for a technology that, again, has to devote most of the rocket to fuel just so you can put a tiny little capsule into orbit.
Because in this room, in this agency, in this country, failure is not an option.
While Apollo 11 is on course for the moon, Deke's wife takes Ed's wife aside at a get-together to have a little talk. The feeling is that if Ed were to completely deny saying what he was quoted as saying, that it would be better for everyone, including Ed, and for his potential trip on Apollo 15. While she's left to consider that, the moment has arrived for the Eagle to separate from Columbia and begin its descent onto the moon. And it's harrowing. Our history is our history, but this is a world where a significant change has happened, where this has gone from a comfortable victory to gambling everything on achieving second place. From the pilots down to the guy who tightens the straps on their chairs, this is going to be a different atmosphere leading to the final moment. This would be an achievement, but not the achievement, the one that they'd been working towards. This wasn't the pressure of being first. It was the pressure of this not being their last. So, when at point of landing the signal goes dead, there's no way of knowing for sure whether this is a simple communication malfunction or the result of the destruction of the LEM. There's no way to know until Columbia can get close in its orbit for Michael Collins to look with a telescope and see what's down there. Well, it's there, in one piece from the looks of it, but as Gene noted, the weight concerns we keep going back to mean the LEM has walls so thin in some places you could pierce them with a screwdriver. After some time, the order is given, as mentioned earlier, for Michael Collins to fly back to Earth without them. He refuses. If he doesn't return with his 2 comrades, he's not returning at all. They're discussing how to change his mind on that when the word finally comes in from Neil Armstrong. The Eagle has landed. America has landed on the moon. And without splatting on the moon. What does that mean then? Let's go on to episode 2 and find out.